the March-April timeframe when everything stopped. And here I am sitting in my office where I'm sitting right now, which is a converted bedroom. And I didn't have a whole lot to do. So I thought, hey, why don't I take a look at what I've done over the past couple of years with regards to auditing? So that was the germination of how this presentation actually started out. And so what I want to do from an agenda standpoint is I want to go back and I want to refresh a presentation that I saw from a registrar, and I'm going to give them credit. And it was a presentation that occurred in early 2017. And what they talked about is what were the issues that they found during the transition and implementation. Now, why this was really important to me at the time was the fact that we were in the process of implementing it. And we were still not sure what registrars were going to be looking at, what they were going to be focusing on. And so what I want to do initially is I want to go back through an early presentation of what people thought were issues and non-issues with regards to the implementation and what people were finding with regards to the audit. Then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take a look at the data I generated. I'm the senior consultant, and the data covers the time window of 2017 to 2020. And I'm actually going to show you the actual clauses where I found nonconformities while I was auditing. And at the same time, I'm going to also take a look at opportunities for improvement. And then finally, I asked myself a couple questions. Could I assess whether or not an organization's QMS matured over time? In other words, there are a number of clients that I had that I'm auditing, they're doing their internal audit year over year. And I was curious, if I took a look at the data, were things getting better for that organization? And the final thing was, what did all of this data reveal about the audits that were being done? And was there something that I could learn as an auditor with regards to maybe doing things better? So that's the agenda. So a couple personal observations before we start looking at information. We all know that ISO 9001:2015 was approved in September. And it's sort of interesting when I think about the end of 2015 and into 2016, one of the things that I noticed when I took a look at my calendar, frankly, I never did an ISO 9001:2015 audit in the years 2015 or 2016. What was interesting was all of my clients weren't ready. And so in the year 2016, the audits that I was doing was against 9001:2008, because all my clients had to maintain their registration until they were ready for 2015. And in the year 2016, everything I was doing in terms of teaching was transitioning and implementation consulting. And it turns out that 2017 was the first year I personally was auditing my clients against the 2015 version of the standard, which I found kind of interesting because I thought I would have done at least one ISO 9001:2015 audit in the year 2016. So let's take a look at what I call early feedback from registrar. And this is built upon a presentation that occurred in early 2017. It was done at BosCon, actually in Salem, Massachusetts. And it was done by one of the registrars that's a fairly large registrar. They're multinational. And I got to know them quite well. And let's walk through what they told us in the beginning of 2017. So what I'm going to talk to you about is what they called non-issues. As they were doing their audits, these were things that people thought would be an issue, but really weren't. The first one was the fact that we all know that with the transition to 2015, you dropped the position of management rep. The reality was, and I saw the same thing, the role was maintained, but in some cases, some of the clients put in place cross-functional teams. Obviously, with the 2015 version of the standard, there was more to do, and frankly, somebody had to be a program manager for the organization. We all know that the standard dropped the preventative action clause. And quite frankly, the feedback that the registrars gave us is really was never really good and was totally misunderstood and misapplied. A lot of people tried to link it to corrective actions. It really should have been linked to the planning of the system. Very few companies, according to the registrars, were using it effectively. But the real key was that this whole notion of risk was added. The term exclusions was dropped. Right now, it's called non-applicable clauses. I mean, they assumed everything is applicable as a starting point, except what is not. The net result by that terminology change was really nothing. A couple other non-issues was the fact that the quality manual was dropped. It turns out that most of my clients, actually all of my clients, retained some quality manual. They put in place what I call a new quality manual. It wasn't the multi-page text, which basically fed back just a standard by changing the organization's name, but it was a new type of a document. It incorporated all the documents per the standard, but the fact that there was no quality manual required really was a non-issue. And there was a new numbering system. I mean, as we know, we went from 8 clauses to 10 clauses, and they don't map. So what was put in place was an ISO correlation matrix. There was no need to renumber documents. And just a note that we put in here, and this was something we heard registrars saying is, look, 2015 is going to be around for greater than 10 years. It is easy to confuse clause numbers between the 2008 version and the 2015 version. And I can tell you, the Quality Support Group does recommend a continual improvement program over time to replace the numbering systems. But these 5 things that we thought might have been issues with the transition into the new standard were not. But what were issues, according to the registrar, were the following. Context of the organization and interested parties were new clauses, 4.1, 4.2. You were supposed to align your QMS to the business management system. It needs to be evident or at minimum covered in a management review, these items. The quality manual could demonstrate alignment, interested parties need to be relevant, and then how does your QMS satisfy their needs? These were issues that the registrar was saying they were finding with regards to their audits. Leadership. We all know that the expectations were raised in terms of their attendance. Are they interested in audits, driving objectives? What do they own, support? What's their interest? And what the registrars were telling me was that they were seeing companies where the leadership really wasn't actively participating, especially with regards to registration audit and management reviews. And as such, there was a number of non-conformities identified. Risks and opportunities were new. And it was much more than just a standard product risk. And you need to consider all key processes. You need to identify, evaluate, act, and assess effectiveness. And you need to review this at management reviews. The feedback that I was getting was that these topics were not being addressed at management review. And just a comment as we go through this. The reason this was important to me and the Quality Support Group is all through 2016, we really didn't know what the registrars were really focusing on. And this is the first time where we got a really good indication of what the issues were. And what's important to us as a Quality Support Group is we were helping people transition. And we wanted to make sure that we were hitting all the right items. Objectives and planning. There were a lot more expectations with regards to how you deal objectives, in terms of what, the resources, the owners, the whens, the evaluations, much more than the 2008 version of the standard. And so there were some nonconformities there. 6.3 was change to your quality management system. It's different than changes with regards to your production area or changes to a design. And this was one of the areas that we found that based upon the registrars that were being overlooked. And so again, you've got to think about the planning considerations, the consequences, the mitigation of changes to your QMS, and this is a place you can apply risk-based thinking. And when we talk about changes to your QMS, we're talking about things like, did you change an ERP system? Did you move a manufacturing area to another factory or another country? Did you make major organizational changes? These are changes to your quality management system that are covered in 6.3, and a lot of what the registrar was telling us is indeed these were not being done well. Organizational knowledge was a new concept in 2015. Again, we're talking about identifying tribal knowledge. It needs to be documented. You need organizational knowledge in all the processes. Do companies have mentoring or succession plans in place? And again, what registrars were telling us, this was a weakness in a lot of clients. Externally provided, we used to know this as purchasing. A lot of companies didn't do a good job outsourcing and identifying contracted needs. This issue of sister organizations are external providers. In other words, if you have different factories in your company, are they giving you products? Well, you need to treat them like external providers. And the one new term that a lot of companies were not doing well was the whole notion of reevaluation of external providers. At least these are the things that registrars were telling us. Post-delivery activities, things like warranty, repair, service, weren't really identified. You need to make sure in this case that you don't have declaring a non-applicability because indeed you're doing these. Non-conforming outputs, it was more than just non-conforming products. So any kind of output in clause 8 could even be design, it could be in contract review, it could be in RFQ. These were issues that registrars were finding. Internal audits. A lot of the clients weren't completing a complete internal audit prior to the certification audits. And then finally, management reviews. They were incomplete. A lot of things were missing, things like changes to the external and internal environments, needs and expectations of interested parties, risks and opportunities. And so in early 2017, we had a window into what registrars were finding with regards to their certification audits. And this was important to us because it helped us focus in on what we really had to work on in terms of transition. Now, as I said, in 2017, we finally started doing audits. And at least I personally started doing audits. And the data that I'm going to show you covers 23 audits. These were done all in person. And yes, the last ones that I did were in February of 2020 before the whole issue of COVID-19 hit. And what I'm going to show you in this data set is actually of the 23 audits, there were actually 13 organizations. One was a pure design. 5 was design and manufacturing, but 3 of them outsourced a piece of their manufacturing. 4 were contract manufacturers and 3 were service organizations. And so again, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to take a look at these 13 organizations and these 23 audits that were done for those 13 organizations. So what did I find through all of these 23 audits? And when I added them up, I had issued 33 majors, 107 minors, and 174 opportunities for improvement. And so when I see this kind of tally, I really needed to start digging into what do these numbers tell me? What do they tell me about the audits I performed? And what do they tell me about myself? So here is a spreadsheet where I actually put in place everything that I found. So when we take a look at the clauses, we know that the requirements are in clauses 4 through 10. The second column moving in from the left are the number of shall statements that we have in each one. There are a total of 131 shalls in the standard. And then I just did the math and I said, what percentage of the shalls by clauses do I find in the various areas? And there was no surprise here. If you look at clause 8, it's the biggest one. 42% of the shalls are there, and the rests are distributed across the other clause numbers. But then what I did was I started looking at the requirements. And again, you see the summary of the requirements in each one of the clauses. And there's a total of 309 of them in ISO 9001:20. And I did the same treatment. I then identified the percent of requirements by clause. I then come over and I take a look at the majors, minors, and opportunities for improvement. And then what I did was I did another column of percentages of majors, minors, opportunities for include, majors, minors, and opportunities for improvement by clause. And one of the things that immediately popped out at me was clause 4. Why the difference? I mean, if I was true to the actual number of requirements by clause, it should have been 7.8, but I came in at 13.4. And I wanted to try to understand why the difference. And the big area that surprised me the most turns out to be clauses 7 and 8. If you notice in the middle, the percent requirement by clauses for 7 should have been 13.9, but actually when I took a look at what I delivered, it was 32.2. When I took a look at clause 8, it was 41.4, but actually I issued 24.8% of them. And so what I did was, these were the 3 clauses that I really wanted to understand why the difference. What was I doing in terms of not necessarily meeting what would have been the normal percentage expected? So let's take a look at clause 7 and 8. And up in the upper right, you're going to see the clause number. And as you can see, clause 7, normally you would have expected 13.9. I had 32.2. Clause 8, you would have expected 41.4. I only had 24.8. So let's take a look and try to figure out what happened. So when I take a look at clause 7, one of the things that I see is, here's the distribution. Infrastructure was 12. Monitoring and measuring resources was 16. Competency was 15. That's typically training. Awareness was 11. But document control, documented information, which is doc control, record control. Notice it was the big hitter that I was finding with a lot of my clients. And yes, there were 6 miscellaneous ones that were spread across clause 7. So the first thing that I see in clause 7, based upon my auditing, was documented information. 7.5 was the one where I was finding most of the problems, most of the nonconformities and opportunities for improvement with my clients. Let's look at clause 8. Clause 8 was slightly a different picture. And when we take a look at where we were finding a lot of the issues, you'll see, well, planning was 3. That was just a general statement at the beginning of clause 8. A few customer items, some in design, but externally provided. That's used to be purchasing. And we found most of them in the purchasing area, some in the normal 8.5, which is the provision of products and services, some with regards to release. And notice I found a significant number in nonconformities. And so at least I knew exactly where I was finding the nonconformities, opportunities for improvement, and I was able to categorize them by clause and subclause. And a couple things jumped up at me. First of all, if I add up the percentages, in other words, if I add up the percent of requirements by clause, it should have been 55.3%. But when I take a look at what I actually generated by adding the 2, it was 57%. And so the difference between the sum of the 2 wasn't all that great. What was also a little interesting to me is when I do my audits, I do process audits. In other words, I don't necessarily go out and audit to clause 7, I go out and audit to clause 8. And so most of the issues that I was picking up were occurring as I was auditing clause 8 and while I was engaging employees. And the 2 things that stand out to me was the fact that in clause 7, I see a lot of issues with regards to documented information, as well as in clause 8, I'm seeing externally provide, which is purchasing 8.4. And those are the processes that I really needed to understand a little bit more. Please bear with me. So the question I asked myself was, why was it that my tendency was to assign greater numbers of majors, minors, and opportunities to clause 7 than what ISO 9001:2015 would have predicted? And the other question is, why was it my tendency, why was it that my tendency was to assign a greater number of majors, minors, opportunities to clause 7 than what the standard would have predicted, since I do process audits. I focus myself on items in clause 8, and as I'm doing that, I'm finding a lot of things that are supporting clause 8 as nonconformities and opportunities. So these were the kind of questions I started asking myself. I really wanted to understand a little more. And when we take a look at a process model, and this is directly from the standard, what we see is this inputs and outputs around a process, and the process has a starting point and an end point. Inputs are matter, energy, information. They're transferred into some different type of matter, energy, transformation. There's a receiver of the outputs. There's sources for the inputs. And the standard says you monitor and measure everything from the sources to the outputs. And so this is the model that ISO 9001 provides with regards to a process model. But when I think about a process, I use a slightly different model. And this is a supplier input process output customer model. It's typically a model known as a SIPOC model, SIPOC. But I kind of expand this kind of model, and this is the kind of model I use when I teach a transition, implementation, or auditing. And I ask my clients to think about different types of inputs in terms of manpower. You know, what people do you need? What training do they need? What skills do they need? Think about the metrics that you use to measure the effectiveness of your process, you know, trend charts, metrics. Think about the materials. All processes have materials. Sure, things like manufacturing have a lot more, but, you know, design, purchasing, they all have materials. All the processes have methods. They could be work instructions, they could be procedures. It's how you do the process. All processes have some amount of equipment, machinery, and all processes need an environment. And so this is the kind of model that I typically use, and this is typically how me as an auditor thinks about processes. And one of the things that I've done, especially when I teach risk-based thinking, is I ask my students to think about things like, what could go wrong with an output? In other words, what could go wrong? And one of the things that we learn when we take a look at this what is let's call this turtle diagram. And one of the things that we learn is when we really want to figure out what's going wrong, usually you don't find it in the big box in the middle, but you find issues with regards to manpower, the metrics you're looking at. You have material issues. You could have problems with, you know, work instructions and procedures where the process and the procedure don't match. You could have equipment issues. You could have changes in your environment. And all of a sudden, you could also have changes that could be external to your process. And so what you're seeing right here is how I look at a process. And the reality is kind of simple. Yes, I started out with a turtle diagram, but please, if you think about this, what I do is I overlay a fishbone diagram on top of the turtle. And this is how I think about a process. And so when I take a look at a fishbone diagram, a little bit different than the one I just showed you, but think about it. If I have a non-conforming effect, you know, this is where I find the issues. In terms of people, I find it in competency, awareness, which I found in the audit. When I think about methods, this is clause 7.5. Could be documents, it could be records. When I see equipment, it's 7.15. This is monitoring and measuring. And from an environment, this is infrastructure, 7.13. And so all of a sudden, as I'm auditing the various processes, I can see how my thought process would immediately want to go and try to figure out what are the inputs to that process that is causing the nonconformity, or maybe it could generate an opportunity for improvement. And so I beginning to understand why I was seeing some of these clause 7 issues with regards to when I do a process audit. And so hopefully it explains my tendency to assign Clause 7 elements while I'm auditing processes that are defined in Clause 8. Now, I also said Clause 4 was a concern of mine. And if we take a look at Clause 4, yes, if I strictly went by the numbers, it would have been 7.8, but I saw 13.4. And notice when I took a look at it, yes, I saw some things in context, interested parties, and the scope, but most of it was with regards to the actual Clause 4.4, which is where you define your key processes with the inputs, the outputs. And one of the things that I found auditing that area is 4.4 had a majority of the areas. Most of the issues were the fact that they didn't identify and weren't monitoring key process indicators, which is required. Now, I could have hit 9.1 with that, but I went specifically there. And a lot of my clients were not identifying process risks and opportunities. Well, I could have also hit those in 6.1, but I chose to put them in 4.4. And the other thing that you see in here is we saw some issues with regards to the scope definition, where they didn't realize that the scope really had to be expanded from ISO 9001-2008. But the key takeaway here in Clause 4 was it's really around the definition of the processes with ISO 9001-2015 having more requirements than the prior versions of the standard. So that was kind of my analysis with regards to Clause 7, 8, and 4. And I am understanding why I was actually assigning the various clauses with a higher percentage than maybe would have been anticipated. But then I started asking myself, were there any trends? And so one of the things that I did was I picked these 6 different companies because I had data with them. And in general, what you're seeing is in most cases, I actually audited them 3 years in a row. So again, one was a contract manufacturer, one was a service provider. 2 of them were design and manufacturing. One was pure design. A third one was design and manufacturing. All of them except the service one and this one, design and manufacturing, I had 3 years worth of information. And so what I did was I asked myself, does a quality management system mature over time? And what I did was I actually tracked them and I plotted them here. As you can see, the blue lines were the 2017 numbers, the red was 2018, and the green was 2019. Now I know it's kind of difficult to understand what all those numbers mean, but when I added them up, one of the things that I did see was that there was a slight improvement. If I averaged out all of the non-conforming findings in 2017, typically on average, I saw 7.5 per client. The year after that, it dropped to 5. In 2019, it dropped to 4.0. And so to answer the question, did the QMS mature over time? I came to the conclusion it has, because I'm finding fewer and fewer things with my clients over this 3-year window. Now, there are other things that were buried in the data, and I looked a little bit deeper. They didn't necessarily jump out when I looked at the processes, but there were a couple areas that I did find a lot of issues. The first was management review. 8.5% of everything that I found was assigned to clause 9.3. I saw missing information. That was the biggest issue. I saw also what I call action items performance against schedule, where people at management review were just saying this needed to be done. They assigned a person to do it. They gave a date, and their performance against schedule was miserable. And one of the reasons why I think I see a lot of things popping up in management review is when I do an internal audit, this is the first thing I audit. I always audit management review because, in my opinion, management review is a roll-up. It is a summary of your quality management system. And this is the place that I go first, because if I don't see something here, it's usually then what I track later on in the audit. So management review popped up as one of the areas where I was identifying a lot of issues. The second area was with regards to clause 10.2, which is corrections and corrective actions. It was 8%. The first thing that I found was a lot of my clients were missing customer complaints. If you read this standard, it says including customer complaints, and they weren't there. Again, same issue as management review, performance against schedule. A lot of overdue corrective actions, they weren't being closed. And the other thing that I found, and it's something that you need to be very careful about with corrective action in the ISO 9001:2015 standard, is if you read it closely, you're supposed to link corrective action to risk and changes to your quality management system. And this was one of the areas that I found weaknesses in. It was one of the areas that, in general, I wrote up as non-conformances. So I gotta have a couple conclusions here, and I apologize. This one here should have come up later. I found it very helpful to take time out and assess the results of prior audits. It really gave me an insight into my thought process while I'm performing these audits. Now that I have an awareness of how I audit, it's helpful by reviewing where the issues have been identified. What it allows me to do is make sure that I'm not overlooking items, that maybe I can't see certain things that are non-conformities or opportunities, and I need to make sure that I'm not being too critical. In other words, that I'm really not too focused in on certain areas, and indeed, I'm going to say maybe a little bit too harsh with regards to my clients. But the one thing that I learned is that I'm seeing these QMSs mature over time. And the other thing that I'm seeing is that the more familiarity I have with the business, it makes for definitely a more effective audit. So one of the things when I reflect back upon the 2015 audit findings, and I take a look at the findings themselves, 3/4 of them would have been an issue with ISO 9001:2008. And one of the things that I found is that the new elements didn't have as big an impact that I thought they would have. Yes, it had some impact, but not necessarily to the extent I had expected. And the other thing that is pretty clear to me, and I don't think it's because I was too harsh, the support processes in clause 7. Those are the ones that really, in my opinion, represent a big opportunity to improve a quality management system. And so that's one of the takeaways. I am still going to audit the same way. I'm still going to take a look at the support processes. And usually they're the ones that I find as I'm auditing the various processes in a quality management system. So I have to conclude with this final slide. The reality is I have not done an in-person audit since February of 2020. I am currently doing remote audits. I did one last week. I'm going to do another one next week. This right now is the new normal, and I'm not sure how long this new normal is going to be around. We work extensively with our clients with regards to performing the remote audits. I'm now identifying non-conformities that I'm identifying in remote audits. And what I intend to do is I'm going to keep track of what I'm finding, and just maybe in 2022 or 2023, I'm going to come back and I'm going to identify, did anything change with regards to the remote audits? And so if you're very interested in remote auditing, there is a very good document. It's actually an ISO document. It's Auditing Practice and Group Guidance on Remote Audits. It's free. It's fairly simple of what you need to do with regards to remote audit, but implementing them can be a challenge. So with that, Chuck, I'm passing it back to you or anybody, and I'm open for questions.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I will unmute everyone. We got a small enough group. I think I'll just be able to unmute everybody if anyone has any questions. Just as long as we do one at a time. And I've got everybody unmuted, so if anyone has a question for Bob, please speak up.
Bob, this is Chuck. One quick question. I asked it before, but I was still on mute. So in any case, on a remote audit, there's several ways to do it. One is to never come to the site and do everything virtually. But then there's also some hybrids where you do off-site, and then you go in a room and you have people, maybe one person, the quality manager, or two people, quality manager, quality engineer, bring in requested items so you can verify. And because if you ask, can you send me some purchase orders or can you send me some records, we may hand pick them, so you may want to come to a site and verify. And the other thing is where you actually go out on the floor under very controlled conditions. So I wonder which type you do.
Everything I do is totally remote.
Totally remote. Okay.
And there's a reason. I'm in a high risk category.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I'm not going into your factory. Now, that said, there are challenges. And let me tell you what the challenges are. The challenges are the production floors, getting out there, being able to see things. This is a WebEx tool. I can tell you, you can put WebEx on a phone and you can go out there.
Yeah.
The other thing is that if your client has paper records out on a production floor, it is almost impossible to audit those records, in which case I've asked them to copy them, scan them, and send them to me.
Yeah.
But I've done an audit with a client out in New York State where the quality manager conducted the audit totally from the couch in his living room. And every area other than manufacturing, the individual was in their home and they linked in and they could show me records if they were electronic, and it works just fine. So the biggest issue with the remote audits is really production and service areas and getting out on the floor, talking to people, seeing what's going on, taking a look at tools out there, trying to read calibration stickers. It's a challenge, but that's the reality that I'm living with today. And by the way, I'm finding stuff. Don't think I'm not finding issues with remote audit. So it's not the most ideal, Chuck. I would rather be on the floor, but that's the reality I work in today. Now, let me also say, yes, you can have a combo audit. You can do certain things remote if you want to do it. If the registrar is willing to come in, that's fine. So it could be a combo as well.
Very good. Thank you, Bob.
Anybody else? I guess I had one question when you were saying that, I think you said that the document info was the old document control. Do you think it's a misinterpretation of the new standard, almost like thinking, oh, we don't need to have documents anymore, like you're saying, the quality manual has changed and the requirements there. Do you think it's a misinterpretation of the new standard that has caused the issue, or
Of the companies that I audited them back in the ISO 9001 2008 day.
okay?
So they can't use the excuse that they didn't think documents aren't important. This is just not maintaining systems. This is the problem. I find documents that are out of rev. I find records that are incomplete. So the clients that I'm auditing, there's no excuse. They understand control of records and control of documents, and all of them have maintained their procedures from 2008. So my feedback is this is a maintenance issue. It's not a misinterpretation of the standard.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Bob?
Yes, I have one, if I might.
Sure.
Wayne Paradise here. In your auditing, have you seen the quality change in the workers? Are they actually, are organizations training these new employees? Do they have the skill sets that they need to do their jobs?
I'm trying to think about how I want to respond to your answer to your question. I'm going to have to answer your question. It depends. I have seen some clients where they have really focused in on certain things, where they take things seriously. In particular, the organizations that don't view corrective actions as punitive, but as, believe it or not, as opportunities to get better. And these companies really do a bang up job solving problems. And they teach the employees how to solve problems. And that in and of itself improves the whole attitude, where a person all of a sudden is asked to help in problem solving, where a couple of years ago they were just told what to do. So in those situations, I have seen definitely a culture improve. I have other clients where it's been status quo, where I don't think it got better or it got worse. I have a client that, quite frankly, they've lost a lot of people, which I think you got to ask yourself, well, why is that happening? And I think in that case, I don't think the whole quality culture has improved. So, as I said, my answer is it depends. It depends. Frankly, it depends on top management. Where the top management is engaged with the employees, I think the culture improves over time.
Thank you.
Bob, comment that I have, just Chuck again. I found it fascinating. One of the big learnings I got out of your presentation is that Clause 7 is such a contributor to, as you called it, the issues, what I really see as a root cause of what some of the problems are. And I think that is a reflection on how deep you go. Like, you don't just go to the first thing, and I wouldn't expect you to, the first or second thing you observe and write that down as a nonconformity. It looks like you've actually thought about, why would this happen? Was it insufficient training? Was it the work environment? Was it the equipment? And I think that is something that for me was a big learning here. Even though I tend to go that way, that's something I'm really going to keep in the back of my mind, that I push harder to go a little deeper and ask people, what do you think?
Well, I go back to that whole picture that I showed you, where I superimposed a fishbone on top of a turtle diagram. And that's really how I think about it. And that's how I apply when I think about risks to a process. I really want to understand the risks of the inputs, and usually that's where you find the issues. So that's just how I just approach it. But thank you for that feedback.
And I was going to bring that up, that the turtle diagrams, I know Chuck a few years ago gave a good presentation on that, and it was great to see it, and how it's, again, a good application of it.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Bob? Again, Bob, I want to thank you. Can't thank you enough for this presentation. Like I said, it was very eye-opening, and I even remembered to get the recording going on this. So we've got it captured, and I'll get that out on our ASQ site and our Facebook page. So
yeah, and Chuck has a PDF, I think.
Oh, excellent. So, but again, I think it was a fascinating look at the drilling in and looking at the numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it was.
So I guess we'll give you a remote applause. Thank you for your time. So
again, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, it was good.
Always good to
Yeah,
learn.
it was quite interesting.
Yeah. Great presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Well, again, that's our technical presentation for tonight. I think we'll take a little, like a little 5-minute break, and we'll start with our leadership team. Let's give a 7-minute break, give everyone a chance to do a bio break, get a drink, and we'll start at 7 o'clock for our leadership meeting. Those of you who want to stick around, you're always welcome. As you log out, you should be getting a pop-up message that will be our voice of the customer, kind of a rating survey, making sure that audio quality was okay, the content of the presentation, and so on. And we'd love to hear back from you. We've also looking for topics for upcoming meetings. I will say that we are hoping by next year that we can have some face-to-face, some nice dinner meetings, and to really get to see everybody again. We are told by ASQ to hold off until at the earliest February 1st. We'll see how that goes. It might be a little later, but I think there's some positive news that we're seeing. So I would hope by mid-year we'll be seeing each other face to face.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Be nice.
Yeah.
So with that, again, thank you for your time, everyone. And yeah, we for the leadership team, let's meet back here in about 5 minutes. I'm going to leave the session open, and then we can get our meeting going, get our meeting on. So.
All righty. See you in a couple.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very
again,
good.
everybody.
Thank you.
All right.
Bob, I still see you there, so thank you again very much.
Okay, anytime, Chuck. Hope to see you soon. Be safe.
Yeah, I was going to see you have a safe trip home, but you're home already.
Yeah, I'm in a bedroom right now.
I was gonna say this remote working, the commute is much better. You just
Well,
gotta recognize that.
it's different, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's different.
So have a good evening.
All
Yeah.
right. Thanks again, Bob. All right. We'll meet back in about 5 minutes. I'm gonna grab a drink. Is anybody there?